So without further ado, let's launch our project. Okay, so we're going to actually connect. Now, technically, I kind of cheated here because I came in with having already launched RStudio, but conventionally you'd have to launch it first. You'd wait a few moments, and then you hit connect. But now we're just going to connect. And just as a reminder, we're loading an RStudio instance for this specific project. Okay, so let's see what we have. All right, so now we're in the RStudio server environment. Just note that I clicked right here. This is JuliaHub. This is the demo project. Note we have two folders, code 1 and code 2. And here, if we look at the bottom right pane, let's get oriented about what's going on. There's projects by name. Oh, we start from the bottom. Home, data, projects by name, Phil, Verons, me, demo project. Folders code 1, code 2. Code 1 files, code 2 files. So first question is, what about the data? What about all my data? Come on, my data. Well, yeah, it doesn't show up in the folders here. Okay, now in the future, this may be different, but at today, October 25th, 2024, it will not show up there. So practically speaking, what does that mean? That means we're going to have to pull data sets from JuliaHub into my R environment, right? Like if you look at my environment here, you don't see the data sets, right? So one of the things we're going to cover here is how to pull data sets that we do need into RStudio, all right? So that's going to be our first question, which is, for example, how do I pull, say, first CSV file and second CSV file into my environment for RStudio so I can do some operations there. Now, but however, let's do also, before I do that though, actually, let's click here. If you go into the folder, I still have my PMX files, PMX1, PMX2. When I click, it opens here, right? So I have some trivial code there. So this works. This is how it works. And the editor space, if you're familiar with RStudio, which I'm sure you are, is obviously opens up here. I want to say one more thing. We do have a live console here. Move this out of the way a little bit. Down here, but we also have a terminal. I mentioned the terminal because whenever we run Julia code, I can actually type Julia, and I'm actually running Julia code. And where's the code running, right? It's running in this same path. So I'm still in the same space here. So I want to be very clear that I may have to change a directory. I may have to maybe change exactly where I am when I'm running my Julia code to make sure the paths are correct, or maybe just load to a different path or write to a different path. But I can actually execute Julia from within the terminal. And so if you ever have a workflow within RStudio where you have to use Julia for whatever reason, and at the moment for us, it's really going to be involved any sort of things involving data sets, but just in general, anything, you would actually be able to run it right here in the terminal itself. Okay, so let's do the first thing. The first thing we need to do right now, and let's put a little comment here. Step 1, pull data set pull first CSV data set into our environment, to our RStudio environment. All right, so we're going to save that. That file has been saved. The time is synchronized. Okay, and just to double check, I should see here if the code here has been shown any. Yes, you see here, the last modified date corresponds to exactly when we made the change here. So these are synchronizing. So the changes here are synchronous. And by the way, remember earlier when I talked about adding files, etc., I can actually create a new file within here, right? So if I wanted to say, new R script here, I could do it, and it would actually persist in here. I didn't refresh it yet, so it won't do it right now. I'd have to, but it would actually persist. So editing through the, yes, I can get rid of that. Yes. Changing your code, because in some cases, and especially in the farmer workflow, you may want to be adding or removing files through the RStudio environment rather than, say, importing files here. And that's okay. Okay. So like, as long as you have the access rights to edit it, that's okay. It will eventually be caught here. So when you are, if you have the edit rights to the project, right, you'll be able to make those changes. It will pick up those changes in the path. All right. In fact, I want to be even more explicit. Let's just make one right now. Make a new file. Okay. I'm going to call it test1. All right. So I made a new blank file called test1.r. It's next to PMXR, and it's in the code folder of our demo project. So we go here, refresh, boom. See how it just picks it up? Test1.r is right there. So there's total synchronization between the actions going on here and within your folders in RStudio and the code folders of the project. Now, what's really important, though, and I want to remind you, is do not put large data sets, large files in here, okay? If you want to put large data files, if you have big simulation results, over 50 meg, things in the tens to hundreds, tens of megabytes plus, you should be using the Datasets API, okay? Make a dataset folder, put it in there. And the word dataset folder is a little bit of a misnomer in the sense that it's not really a folder. It's more like a slot because there's no, at least not yet, there's no corresponding folder in the file system to indicate that indeed there's a dataset folder per se. It just, what the handy thing about the data sets here is that I don't necessarily have them all just in one descending table. I can actually have some sort of organization. So that's nice. So if we go back to here, as we mentioned earlier, our first objective right now is to pull the first CSV data set. So we want to get, which data set do we want? We want the first CSV file. Okay, so that's the name of the data set. So it's called pull first CSV file data set into our RStudio environment. So if we're able to get, and where does it sit? If we click on data sets, I'm going to open a new tab here. My data sets. The first CSV file. This is the data set information. Okay, data sets, my data sets, first CSV file. So the data set name is first CSV file. But the name which I'm going to assign it when I actually download it is whatever I want. Okay, just remember, this is a data set. Data sets are not files. 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 Data sets are wrappers around files. I can put anything in a data set. I can have a CSV, text, JPEG, system image, binary code, doesn't matter. It's in, as a data set, it's all treated the same. This is simply a label to it. When I download this data set, only then will I specify both the file name and the extension to the file. Okay? So we're going to use a library to download this. This is the current practice as of today. This may change in the future, but as of today, we're going to use a special R library that we developed internally to pull the data set from JuliaHub into the RStudio environment so we can work with the CSV data. So what are we doing here concretely with the data sets? We're actually going to, in some ways, break our own rules because we're going to be downloading a data set into our file system in RStudio. That's the way it works right now. But the thing is, nothing will actually break because we're going to use the JuliaHub JL, which is the official client API for JuliaHub. And it has a very powerful data transfer feature, which we're going to use. So the first thing we're going to do is in our terminal, we have to make sure we're in the correct path, the desired path. So if we're in demo projects here, right, I guess I could put it in the code folder, which I'll just do that for argument's sake. I'm going to run Julia here. And the first thing I need to do is say, using JuliaHub. which is the name of the package, and it's going to say package not found, but it's available from registry. Install it. Say yes. So we're installing the JuliaHub package. This is going to give us full connectivity with the JuliaHub API. Now, what's interesting about JuliaHub JL is JuliaHub JL is authenticated with respect to our current user, right? So all the access rights that I have as a user on JuliaHub.com are already synchronized completely and perfectly with JuliaHub JL because it's the same user. It's me. So I'm not going to be able to access anything. I don't have to worry about any changes to permissions or access rights of any kind or roles. Okay, great. So the first thing I want to do right now is there are several options. I mean, one thing we should do first is test it, right? See if we can list the data sets. And I'm going to do is I'm going to list the data sets. I'm going to type JuliaHub.datasets. And this will simply return all the data sets to which I have access. Now, which is the file I want? For a CSV file, right? That's the one I want. So if you look at these two arguments here, the first one is the username, me, and the second one is the dataset name. So I want to grab this dataset. I'm going to save it as a CSV file in this code. It will show up in this code folder, and then it is accessible to our PMX script, which can then load the CSV data and maybe write a result that can be also evaluated by the test R script. Okay, so let's do that. Let's download this data set. So I'm going to do JuliaHub.download dataset. I'll call it first CSV file, and we're going to save it as CSV data1.csv. Done. Okay. Very quick. Shows the path, and here's the data file. If we want to, we can actually view it. And look at that. There's our CSV file. Now, this hasn't been loaded yet as a data frame into the environment, but that's something we can do later. So now, let's see. What can we do here? We can actually make a change to that CSV file. Oh, another thing. Let's go back, however, to demo projects and see what happens to our repo. This is really important. Note that the data file has been added as a file in this repo, okay? So in this specific case, we've added a file to the repo itself. This is very different than, for example, importing the file into the environment. And there's another way to do that using a specific R library called JuliaHub Datasets. But in our case, we're working with the actual JuliaHub Dataset API, and I just want to show how the datasets can be added directly as code to a file if needed. Now, this is not best practices for large files. We've been through this many times. However, I am very, very aware of the reality in pharma workflows that you're going to have data in your repo. You're going to. And as long as the size of the data is not very big, a few hundred kilobytes, etc., maybe a megabyte or two here and there, that's fine. Where you really, really, really run into trouble is when that starts getting big. And in general, you want to avoid doing this. Like, yes, we can do this. Yes, it's possible for us to put the CSV file in here and run it. But it's definitely superior to just have it sitting in the environment itself directly, rather than sitting as a file in your folder. Okay. But I'm also aware, and this is also a reality of the pharma workflow, is that you need the record anyway of the data set, right, for validation purposes. So in any case, many times you don't have a choice. You may just have to put a file in that folder anyway for bookkeeping purposes. Obviously, it may not be in code. You may have a completely different file structure. This is just for demo purposes. But now I can easily write our code to read the CSV, the data1 CSV file, and do whatever I want with it. But the question then is, how would I then get any results out of this environment into JuliaHub? Okay, and one of the reasons I started with the JuliaHub JL API, this thing called using, where we typed this thing, we said using JuliaHub. The reason I started with this is that this is a one-stop shop. If you use this solution, you can not only download the data sets, but you can also push them back into JuliaHub, right? So let's think of something we can do to this data set. I'm going to put a little bit of code in here, our code in here. I'm going to create a new data set, and we're going to push that new data set up as the new version. All right? So let me just pause and we'll put that in there. So something to be aware of here is there's actually a discrepancy between the current path here and where we are here, right? So if we did like list.files, this is not where we have here. So we need to actually set our working directory, and we can get that this way to match. So here, put that in here. And now if we do list.files, this looks right. Okay, this is important because I want to synchronize this code with what I'm going to test here. So if I do df equals read.csv data1.csv, voila, I get the desired data frame. Okay. So we'll say df small equals df, let's do a truncation. Okay, so let's make a new data frame called df small equals df1. All right, and that's just going to be first row. Okay, that looks about right. Okay, and now we're going to save this df1 result. So we have the df, writing out the df small, and it's going to be data out.csv. And voila, there it is. Okay, so now I did a relatively trivial change. I just downloaded a data set, sliced the first row. Now I want to push it back, right? I imported a data set from JuliaHub. I sliced the first row, made a change. I call it my data out CSV, and now I want to push it back to JuliaHub as a new data set. So I go back to my terminal. This is where I can see now I go to my terminal, especially for pushing data up into JuliaHub. Okay, and now I'm going to do JuliaHub.upload data set. And first thing I need to do is give it a name. I'll call it maybe PMX output. And then I'll have the file name, data out.csv. Enter. Okay. I now need to level with you guys. The data sets are a thing called blobs. If you've worked with databases at all, you'd be familiar with this. If you don't know what a blob is, it doesn't matter. If you do know, I don't need to tell you, so we can move on. But that's what you're going to see. It's a blob. See everything transferred. The owner, here's a nice little metadata here. Me, description, I didn't have any, version 1. Now, what's interesting too, or I should say what's interesting also, is what happens if I keep running this upload multiple times, right? Does it overwrite it? I mean, what do you think it's going to do? And if I keep running it multiple times, it says it already exists. It gives me an error. I have to decide if I'm going to have update or replace as true. What does that mean? When I run this command, I could specify update equals true or update equals false. So that means when I make a change, it's going to change the version. So let's see what that looks like right now in data sets. First, let's just see if the data set got in there. So the PMX output data set is here, right? It's here. Notice, though, that it's not associated with the project. We need to actually associate it with the project. So you see how it's the data set's kind of floating out there? It would be nice to associate that data set with our project. So we're going to go to attach data set and it's PMX output. Okay, great. So now when we go to data sets and we hit PMX output, it's no longer floating in space. It's now well, this is not refresh. I apologize. I have to refresh that. It's now with the demo project. Okay. So if I were to go, if I'm browsing, if me or another user is browsing this, you see, oh, okay, demo project me, added today. Or, well, oh, the project, that's the project added date, but don't get confused. The project was made yesterday and that was added today. But we're still on version 1. All right. And in projects, we have the same information. Version 1. Okay. So if we go to RStudio server and we set this update. So let's say now I have the same JuliaHub upload dataset command, dataset label, PMX output, so it's a matching dataset name. Okay. Same file that we're using, data out.csv, but now I put update equals true. What's going to change? Version. You see? The versioning is automatic. I just refresh. Version 2. Datasets. Version 2. Okay? So you see how that works? So we've gone through the whole life cycle of using that. Now also, I have another option for uploading datasets. I could put replace equals true. Right? And when, actually, if I put replace equals true, what do you think happens to the version? Guesses? Think. I think you'll know. Goes back to version 1. Just overwrites it completely. So you have options when you're uploading data sets to update a data set without changing the name. And this is what's really nice is like if I'm running the various scenarios or I want to keep track of things and I don't necessarily want to lose my history, which is definitely the case in the Farmer workflow. I have the option of having, in this case, 3 versions I just made, right? And voila, it's right there. And it's, and each version, by the way, needs to be separately associated. So the versions are treated uniquely. That's why some of them are not showing up. You see, I actually only have the, what's going on here? Okay, let me try this again. PMX output. Yeah, so I got the latest version here, version 3. So just be mindful that when you're adding the data sets, right, from RStudio, you have these 2 degrees of freedom. You have the update argument, it's a keyword argument actually, and the replace keyword argument. So now you've seen the basic workflow in RStudio of how to pull data sets into your folder and how to push them out. If we get a chance, we can do a separate session possibly on using a special package that would actually, instead of pulling it as a file, we'll actually pull it into the environment as our data set. So we avoid touching the file system here. In any case, though, you're going to end up touching the file system whether we like it or not, right? I mean, it's kind of a technicality at that point because once the data set is being consumed here in memory, in many cases, it needs to be stored anyway as a file, but it is better to keep it as a data set. So in the next session, we're going to cover using an R-specific library that avoids having to initially download the data set, as we did here, into the folder originally. But you now know how to get the data in and out of your RStudio session with JuliaHub. And it's actually quite easy. And again, it all happens at the terminal. That's where the action is. And one more thing with the terminal, it's very important to make sure that your paths are correct. For example, if I were to, I'm going to do a little dirty trick here. If I were to do something like this, and now I go back to Julia and I say upload, upload data set, it's not going to find the folder because I changed directory. So just remember that the Julia terminal here works with respect to a path. You need to make sure you're in the right path for this thing to work, just like in here. All right? Well, thank you guys. This has been great, and see you in the next video.